Committee will come to order. The Subcommittee on Aviation and Space of the United States Senate's Committee on Commerce convenes today for what I consider a very important hearing. 57 days ago, our nation witnessed the first major U.S. commercial passenger flight crash in nearly 16 years. Families had their loved ones taken from them in an instant. Children lost their parents, husbands lost their wives, a Kansas couple lost their daughter, and a rural community in our state called Kiowa lost a husband and wife, a pillar of the community, who were traveling to visit their daughter in college. I've taken that American flight before. There were many Kansans on that flight, and several of the members of this committee lost constituents on the American Airlines Flight 5342 and the Army's Black Hawk helicopter. In addition to the families who are grieving, our first responders made heroic efforts to find survivors and save lives, and the investigators have spent nearly 2 months searching the Potomac River and working to reconstruct wreckage to find answers. It has been a difficult 57 days. 67 lives that were lost on January 29th were taken prematurely in an accident that, by all indications, should have been avoided. Now, the families of these victims, the Federal Aviation Administration, the National Transportation Safety Board, the U.S. Army, and Congress are tasked with how to best honor the memory and make certain accidents like this never happen again. I want to highlight NTSB Chair Jennifer Hamady and NTSB Board for their diligence and transparency throughout the investigations. That job obviously is not an easy one, but it's been done with professionalism and care. It's their work that we are here, that brings us here today to review. NTSB's preliminary report into the mid-air collision provides insight into the events of January 29th, but many questions, certainly in my view, many questions still need to be answered, not only by the NTSB's investigation, but by our nation's aviation safety regulator and by the Army. The preliminary report provides alarming statistics in using existing FAA data on the risks at DCA to aviation safety. That data includes, and NTSB provides these numbers. In a 13-year period, not a single month went by without at least one, quote, close call between a helicopter and a commercial jet operating at DCA. Between October 21 and December 24, there were 85 incidents where the lateral separation between a commercial jet and a helicopter was less than 1,500 feet, and the vertical separation was less than 200 feet. And during that same time frame, there were more than 15,000, quote, close proximity events between a helicopter and a commercial airplane. The NTSB findings that it is possible for a helicopter on Route 4 to have as little as 75 feet of vertical separation from airplanes on approach to runway 33. I commend the NTSB for issuing urgent safety recommendations, and I commend the FAA in acting to implement them, particularly the permanent restriction of non-essential helicopter operations at DCA. However, I want to know how, with these statistics in the FAA files, why prior to January 29th, the agency failed to improve safety protocols at Reagan National Airport. This committee worked tirelessly to pass an FAA reauthorization bill last Congress that prioritized safety, enabling our industry to continue innovating and equipping the FAA with the resources necessary to keep our skies safe. We need a permanent confirmed FAA administrator to implement this important framework for the future of the industry. President Trump recently nominated Brian Bedford to lead the FAA, and I look forward to his testimony before this committee in the near future. I commend Secretary Duffy for his push to modernize airspace, and I look forward to this subcommittee working together to keep America's traveling public safe and improve public trust in our air travel system. Demand for commercial aviation is expected to grow 4% each year over the next 2 decades, and along with new technology and commercial spacecraft entering our airspace. This will further place demands upon our airspace and require the tools and guidelines to ensure a safe airspace. American Airlines Flight 5342 and Priority Air Transport 25 carried innocent civilians, selfless service members, talented figure skaters, fathers and mothers, husbands and wives, sons and daughters. And while Congress' response to the January 29th ought to be deliberate and not executed in a knee-jerk fashion, Congress must make certain that this loss of life occurs never again. In this early investigation, we have many unresolved questions. Among those for me is, why was the ADSB out, not transmitting on the Black Hawk? Was it turned off or was there equipment malfunction? Why had precautions not been taken to mitigate the risk of collisions between commercial aircraft and rotor wing near DCA, the statistics I just described? What is the severity of this issue at other airports where combined traffic is also high? What explains the discrepancy between the altitude readings of the crew of the Black Hawk? Why did the Black Hawk's invalid pressure altitude data influence other systems that utilize this source? How the use of night vision goggles may have impacted the Black Hawk helicopter pilot's line of vision? And finally, how should the FAA evaluate combining duties of air traffic controllers? I'm appreciative for our witnesses being here today. I know they each take this circumstance seriously. I'm anxious to hear the discussion that they have with this committee. And the end result should be a better understanding, as well as working to identify and prevent tragedies today and into the future. I now recognize the ranking member of this subcommittee, Senator Duckworth, the senator from Illinois, for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Moran, and thank you for your continued partnership on aviation safety issues. I enjoy being your partner on this subcommittee, and I want to thank both the chairman of the Commerce Committee and the ranking member for your work with us as well. I do want to extend, first and foremost, my condolences to the family members of the victims, some of whom are here with us today, both on the commercial airliner as well as the family members who lost the brave soldiers in the Black Hawk helicopter. These are folks who put on the colors of this great nation, committed themselves to defending this great nation, and were at their duty stations training to protect and defend us as they lost their lives. I also want to thank the first responders and everyone at NTSB for their tireless work to get us the answers that we all are looking for. There's a saying, and as many of you have heard it, our aviation regulations are written in blood. So we have an obligation to the victims to learn what went wrong and prevent a collision like this from ever happening again. As a former Black Hawk pilot myself, and I have flown helicopters out of very congested aircraft at Midway Airport. In fact, I commanded the Midway unit for a number of years. I know how challenging this type of mixed-use airspace can be. But a challenging airspace is no excuse. This should never have happened. This collision was horrendous, and it is heartbreaking. But it was not a surprise. Our alarm bells about potential collisions have been ringing for years. Coming out of the pandemic, we saw a frightening rise in close calls and an erosion of our aviation system's margin of safety. We've known for years that we need more air traffic controllers and more safety technology. The warnings have been clear, and in some cases, right here within this committee, in a bipartisan consensus on the need to upgrade the equipment and the need to train more air traffic controllers. In November 2023, we held a hearing on close calls. NTSB Chair Hamady testified, citing staffing shortages, fatigue, distraction, deviation from FAA regulations, and a lack of runway safety technology. And she warned, and I quote, The concerning uptick in such incidents is a clear warning sign that the U.S. aviation system is sharply strained. We cannot wait until a fatal accident forces action. We must act before there is a tragedy." End quote. Chairwoman, just sadly predictive of what was going to happen, and you said that in 2023. At the same hearing, the National Air Traffic Controller Association's president told us that staffing shortages were so bad that many air traffic controllers were working mandatory overtime, 6-day work weeks, and 10-hour days. He warned, and I quote, "Over the long term, this will continue to introduce unnecessary risk into the system," end quote. So we passed in a bipartisan way FAA reauthorization bill last year to help rebuild our aviation workforce and make critical investments in safety. The FAA is still implementing that new law, but clearly Congress has more work to do to shore up aviation safety in this great nation. In December of 2024, we held another hearing. The GAO told us that more than 75% of our aging air traffic control systems are unsustainable or potentially unsustainable. The deadly collision at DCA is not the only aviation safety incident so far this year. We've seen deadly crashes in Philadelphia and Alaska, a crash landing in Toronto that miraculously everyone survived, even after the aircraft flipped upside down. Earlier this month, we saw passengers standing on the wing of a 737 aircraft in Denver to escape a fire. And near misses keep happening. In February, a Southwest flight came within 200 feet of colliding with a FlexJet plane at Midway Airport. At such a dangerous time for aviation safety, when we need to bolster our workforce and invest in technology, the last thing we should be doing is making cuts to the FAA. Yet 2 weeks after the DCA crash, the Trump administration began firing hundreds of FAA employees. I say all of this because it is important context we need to keep in mind during today's hearing. We need to understand what happened at DCA, but we also need to understand how this fits into a much larger threat to aviation safety. According to the NTSB, DCA had many close calls in recent years between October 2021 and December 2024. As the chairman has said, there were more than 15,000 instances of commercial aircraft coming close to rotary wing aircraft. 85 of those had a vertical separation of less than 200 feet. And last year, there were also 2 high-profile runway close calls at DCA. NTSB's preliminary report raises several questions. Most notably, how did FAA allow a helicopter route to come within 75 feet of a runway approach? FAA has deconflicted the airspace, but DCA is not the only airport in the country where airplanes and helicopters share congested airspace. Several of us raised this at an earlier briefing, and thankfully, FAA is now evaluating 8 cities where this may also be an issue, including in Chicago. We also need to know more about what helicopter pilots knew about their altitude. Was their equipment working properly? Voice recordings showed the pilot and instructor pilot indicated different altitudes as they approached the Key Bridge, and NTSB determined that some of the altitude information on the helicopter's data recorder was invalid. There are also questions about ADSB. Why was the helicopter not transmitting ADSB out? Do commercial aircraft need to be equipped with ADSB in? How come so many helicopters are allowed exemptions from the ADSB out requirement at DCA? So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back, Chairman.
Ranking Member Duckworth, thank you very much for your opening statement. She almost called me the ranking member.
I did.
There's no reason to apologize. Senator Duckworth was the previous chairman of this subcommittee, and I had a great opportunity to work with her as the ranking member. And I would indicate certainly to Senator Duckworth, but to those in the audience, this is a subcommittee that will set partisanship aside, and we will continue to work closely together to find the answers that we're looking for today, and beyond finding the answers, making certain that changes are made to prevent this tragedy. We are joined by the chairman of the full committee, Senator Cruz, and I now appreciate his presence here and his leadership on this issue from the very beginning, and I now recognize him for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member as well. I want to thank each of the witnesses for being here today, and I want to extend a particular welcome to the family members of the 67 crash victims who are here today for this hearing. I've met with many of you since the crash, and each of you have my very deepest condolences for your unimaginable loss. The crash involving American Airlines Flight 5342 and the Army Black Hawk helicopter was preventable. It didn't have to happen. And I want you to know that I am committed to using the power of this committee to determine if any policy failures led to this crash and making certain that Congress acts to correct them. This accident marks the first time a commercial crash in the United States has led to mass fatalities in over 15 years. While America's national airspace system has kept Americans safe for decades, this critical juncture shows that more action must take place to enhance the safety of our system. The hearing today will examine the factors leading up to the midair collision 300 feet above the Potomac River. Whether the Army's practice of disabling ADSB out is a glaring safety concern. Whether the FAA missed warning signs with thousands of instances where helicopters and commercial aircraft at DCA came too close to colliding. Whether the communications between the air traffic controller and both of the pilots of the American Airlines flight and the Black Hawk helicopter was inadequate. The families of the American Airlines Flight 5342 victims deserve answers. Congress deserves answers. And the American flying public deserves answers to these important questions. The NTSB does terrific work. I'm grateful to Chairman Jennifer Homendy and her team for their thorough investigation of this accident. The preliminary report being discussed today is factual. It does not include analysis, nor does it include findings. It is just one step in what will be a lengthy and ongoing investigation. This committee will closely follow how that investigation proceeds and look forward to the NTSB's full findings. Some actions, however, cannot wait. Aviation safety is dependent on what is called the Swiss cheese model. Each layer of cheese represents a defense against an identified risk, building redundancy into the system to plug holes and prevent accidents. After decades of advancements, the U.S. aviation system has been held up worldwide as the gold standard of safety. The FAA's air traffic organization depends on thousands of talented air traffic controllers, hundreds of millions of dollars in annual investments to sustain technologies used to operate the air system, and billions more invested in technologies and facilities across the system. Even with these significant investments, the air traffic system is failing. Facilities, which are falling apart, are short-staffed, and projections show that the shortages will last for years. Over the weekend, the NOTAM system broke down for a third time in just 2 years. Congress has provided tens of millions of dollars in the past two years to modernize the NOTAM system, and it is broken down already twice this calendar year. President Trump and Secretary Duffy have pledged to take action to improve the air traffic control system. I plan to lead this committee in passing legislation to do the same. We must provide resources for the needed short, medium, and long-term improvements that chart the path to success and sustainment for the air traffic system. Earlier this week, I issued a call to aviation stakeholders for specific ideas to improve the air traffic system. I asked for concrete proposals, taking nothing off the table prematurely to make sure that whatever resources and authorities Congress provides to the administration will make a lasting difference. My proposal will complement the Trump administration's forthcoming plan. What the tragedy of Flight 5342 shows us is that it is never too early to act to improve aviation safety. I want to thank the families of the victims for taking your enormous grief and channeling it into energy, channeling it into advocacy, channeling it into standing up and speaking out for other families flying on other flights, fighting for them so they don't have to endure the grief and loss that each of you is enduring. It is my hope that we can spend the coming months in the wake of this tragedy working seriously to plug safety gaps and to ensure that an accident of this magnitude never happens again. Thank you.
Chairman Cruz, thank you for your opening remarks, your leadership today, and your leadership into the future. We now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the senator from Washington State, Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Chairman Moran. Thank you, Ranking Member Duckworth. Thank you, Full Committee Chairman Cruz. We're here today to examine one of the most devastating accidents in U.S. history. With 67 lives lost on January 29th, we have a responsibility to not only understand what happened, but to fix it so that it never happens again. I want to recognize the families who are here with us today and express my condolences, but also my appreciation for the diligence that you now are demonstrating by being here today. Too much of aviation safety in the last several years have been left to the advocacies of families. We shouldn't have to rely on you. You should be able to mourn your losses. But we need you to continue to advocate for these important policies. I welcome NTSB Chair Jennifer Hamady, FAA Acting Administrator Chris Richelieu, and Brigadier General Matt Bramman, and who is the Director of Army Aviation. You're here to provide us an update on this collision and why a Black Hawk helicopter on a training flight collided with this American Airlines flight. As we seek answers, the NTSB's preliminary report has alarming facts. First, in the 3-year period leading up to the collision, commercial airplane and helicopters got within 400 feet of each other on 15,214 occasions, within 200 feet on 85 occasions. FAA's air traffic managers approve helicopter route charts annually, so that if the data raised questions about the safety of these routes, the ball clearly falls into the FAA's court as to whether to act on this data or make changes where the helicopters can fly in DCA. A helicopter at 200 feet would only have 75 vertical feet separation from an airplane approaching on runway 33. These findings reveal a very systemic issue that demand answers from our witnesses today. Acting Administrator Richelieu, I want to know, why did the FAA not act? Why did the FAA not act on 15,000 reports of dangerous proximity? How were these helicopter routes allowed to remain when alarm bells were literally going off in the towers? This lack of oversight must change. The Army Black Hawk helicopter was not transmitting what is known as ADS-B out signal, although we don't know why. What we do know is that the military told our colleagues, House Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton in 2023, that the military operates 100% of its flights in the National Capital Region without this safety technology, 100% of the time. On March 7th, I wrote Secretary Hegseth about this issue for a response, asking to respond by March 21st. I've still heard nothing back. I do not like this silence. It's deafening. General Bramman, I have questions about these policies, especially given that the FAA's 2019 rule stating that the deactivation of the ADS-B out technology pursuant to an exemption was not to be routine. Well, the Holmes letter says that not only was it far from routine, 100% of the time operated with this exemption. Acting Administrator Richelieu, your agency gave government airspace users a loophole. What we want to know now is why this was allowed to continue if we had this data and information. And are there any other agencies that are acting with ADS-B out that we haven't addressed yet? The FAA rule needs to change. Chair Hamady, I will be asking you about ADS-B requirements. In 2010, the FAA said that it was premature to require this kind of equipment on operators. Yet, at the same time the FAA made that decision, just 2 years earlier, you wrote a letter saying, disagreeing with them, but saying that the conclusion stating the, quote, the equipage of aircraft with ADBS out in capacity will provide for an immediate substantial contribution to safety, especially during operations in and around airports. Why did we not listen? 15 years later, commercial aircraft are still not operating with this. If American Airlines regional jet had been equipped with this ADBS in, it would have been able to receive the Black Hawk's transmission, giving it a better intelligence on positioning. Tim Lilly, the father of the pilot from the commercial craft, who he himself is also Black Hawk helicopter pilot, and his wife, Sherry, spent many years working at Gulfstream. They know a thing or two about aviation. They gave me a list of actions they hope Congress can take to improve safety. Mr. Chairman, we all need to work together on this critical safety legislation. Legislation to close the ADSB out loophole, require more commercial jets to have ADSB in capacity when operating near our nation's busiest airports, and have stronger information sharing between our military and civilian authorities. This isn't just about policy, it is about saving lives. To my colleagues, I hope that we can work together in a bipartisan fashion, since the FAA Reauthorization Act did require next-gen completion by 2025. We also directed the FAA to develop a plan for accelerating airline equipage with next-gen technologies, and authorized $17 billion through 2028 to modernize and replace the FAA ATC systems and infrastructure. So I do want to say, I do not believe in cutting the services, the benefits, or the training of our air traffic controllers. We need them, and we need them to do their job. I supported Senator Cruz's efforts to continue to advance more training centers to get more air traffic controllers trained. But now we need to learn this painful lesson. We need to make sure that we are preventing future accidents from happening. We must be unwavering in this effort. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Ranking Member Cantwell, thank you for your opening statement. I'll now introduce our panelists who are here to testify. Our first witness is Jennifer, I'm sorry, I should put a title before you. Our first witness is Chairman Jennifer Hamady of the National Transportation Safety Board. The NTSB is an independent federal agency that investigates every civil aviation accident in the United States and significant events in other modes of transportation such as rail, transit, roadway, and pipeline. She has served as the chairwoman since 2021 and is a member of the NTSB board since 2018. Our second witness is Mr. Chris Rochelot, Acting Administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration. Mr. Rochelot has served at the FAA for more than 20 years in multiple roles, including as Deputy Associate Administrator for Aviation Safety. And our third witness is Brigadier General Matthew Brahman, Director of Army Aviation for the headquarters of the Department of the Army. Throughout his service, General Brahman has deployed over 36 months supporting overseas contingency operations. And I thank you, General, for your service. I now recognize Chairman Jennifer Hamady to deliver her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Moran, Ranking Member Duckworth, Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Cantwell, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to provide you with an update on our investigation of the midair collision that occurred over the Potomac River near Reagan National Airport on January 29th. The NTSB knows tragedy all too well. We experience it every day, which is why we fight so hard for safety. Yesterday, we remembered the 6 lives lost during the collapse of the Key Bridge in Baltimore a year ago. Today, we once again mourn the 67 lives lost at DCA, the 7 in Philadelphia, 10 in Nome, Alaska. We often talk about safety in terms of numbers. Did accidents, fatalities go up or down? It's important that we remember today that those who died at DCA and in other accidents we investigate aren't numbers. As you said, these are mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, wives, husbands, cousins, best friends who won't be there with their loved ones for Easter egg hunts, Passover seders, the end of Ramadan, Mother's Day, Father's Day, graduation, all of life's celebrations. Their families and friends, whether in person or online, are here today. I can only imagine what they're going through, and I want to take a moment to again express our deepest sympathies to each of them. Please know that we keep you in our hearts as we diligently work to determine how this tragedy happened so no one experiences the deeply significant loss you must feel today. NTSB was on scene that night within an hour of the collision, and we remained there for over a month. Work continues to this day, including diving operations to recover personal effects and any remaining portions of the wreckage. On March 11th, we released our preliminary report, which contains only factual information that we've gathered in the first few weeks, all of which can change throughout the course of the investigation. It doesn't include analysis or findings, nor does it determine probable cause. Those will be in our final report. But we don't wait for a final report to take action if we uncover critical safety issues that require immediate attention, which is why, in conjunction with the release of our preliminary report, we also issued 2 urgent safety recommendations to the FAA. In both reports, we cited FAA surveillance data that showed between October 2021 and December 2024, there were over 15,000 close proximity events between commercial aircraft and helicopters at DCA. In reviewing that and other data, including airport operations and established helicopter routes, we determined that the separation distances between helicopter traffic operating on Route 4 and aircraft using runways 15 and 33 are insufficient and pose an intolerable risk to aviation safety. As a result, we recommended that the FAA prohibit operations on helicopter Route 4 between Haynes Point and Wilson Bridge when those runways are being used for departures and arrivals. We also recommended that the FAA designate an alternative helicopter route that can be used to facilitate travel between Haynes Point and the Wilson Bridge when that segment of Route 4 is closed. I want to commend Secretary Duffy for his swift acceptance of our recommendations. The Secretary and the Acting Administrator and the General have been tremendous partners throughout the course of this investigation, and I want to thank them for their commitment to safety. I know we're all searching for answers, the right safety solutions, but the NTSB is the gold standard for accident investigations for a reason. We are thorough and we're fact-based. We leave no stone unturned, and we let the evidence guide us. Investigations take time. We have a lot of work to do in this investigation, from interviews to analyses of large volumes of documents and data to review, to air carrier operations that we have to review, helicopter operations, air traffic control, human performance, helicopter airworthiness, flight recorders, and more. In total, we have about 40 NTSB experts leading this investigation in collaboration with the parties and others, and we're aiming to complete this investigation within 1 year, barring, of course, any unforeseen circumstances. Now, I want to close by thanking you for your steadfast support of the NTSB, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman. We now recognize the Acting Administrator Rocheleau of the FAA for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Moran, Ranking Member Duckworth, Chairman Cruz, and Ranking Member Cantwell, as well as members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss the NTSB's preliminary report on the midair collision of PSA Airlines 5342 and a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter that occurred in January near Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, or DCA. I would like to begin by offering my sincere sympathies to the families and loved ones of those who perished in recent aviation accidents, particularly the accident near DCA. The FAA continues to support the ongoing NTSB investigations. Our work with the NTSB will help us understand the factors that contributed to these accidents and we will use the data to inform future FAA actions. Aviation safety is the FAA's #1 priority. Let me repeat that. Aviation safety is the FAA's #1 priority. While flying remains the safest mode of transportation, aviation safety is not static. There's always room for improvement. The professionals at the FAA take their jobs very seriously and strive to ensure safety every day. But the fact of the matter is, we have to do better. We have to identify trends. We have to get smarter on how we use data. And when we put corrective actions in place, we must implement them with diligence. I want to thank Chair Hamady and the entire NTSB team for their dedication in their ongoing investigation. Earlier this month, the NTSB issued an initial report and 2 urgent safety recommendations. The recommendations align with the actions the FAA took under Secretary Duffy's leadership immediately following the accident to restrict helicopter operations around DCA, eliminating mixed helicopter and fixed-wing traffic, and carefully developing alternative routes. Following the NTSB recommendations, the FAA took action to make these restrictions permanent. When essential helicopter operations, such as life-saving medical, active law enforcement, active air defense, or presidential transport must operate in the flight-restricted airspace, fixed-wing aircraft are not allowed in that airspace. We're also continuing to analyze other airports that have both established helicopter routes and nearby airplane traffic. The FAA is also carefully reviewing offshore helicopter operations. As part of this analysis, we're using machine learning and language modeling to scan incident reports and explore multiple data sources to find themes and areas of concern. We will take immediate action if needed to mitigate any identified safety risks. Additionally, I will establish a safety risk management panel and engage with aviation stakeholders to identify additional hazard areas involving helicopter and fixed-wing interactions. And all aircraft operating in DCA Class B airspace will be required to broadcast their position and identification using ADS-B out, with very limited exceptions. We're bolstering aviation safety in other ways too. Air traffic control staffing is a top priority, as air traffic controllers play a critical role in keeping the American people safe. Right now, we have over 10,750 controllers on the job, with over 3,000 in training. We intend to hire another 2,000 controllers this year. We have streamlined the hiring process and incentivized hiring with a 30% increase in the salary of those who qualify to attend the FAA's academy. And we're already seeing positive results from these improvements. During the hiring surge that closed last week, we received over 10,000 applications, and more than 8,000 of those were referred to testing. We also continue to maintain rigorous oversight of Boeing to ensure the safety and compliance of its aircraft designs and operations. This oversight extends to ongoing monitoring of Boeing manufacturing practices, maintenance procedures, and software updates. We're working closely with Boeing to address any safety concerns and to ensure that all required modifications and improvements are made to meet the highest safety standards. We have a strong foundation at the FAA, and we're going to make our agency even stronger. We are refocusing our energy and directing all of our resources to safety, and will continue to recruit, train, and retain the best and brightest for the FAA team. I thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I also thank President Trump and Secretary Duffy for putting their faith in me to lead the FAA during this time. The work we do at the FAA isn't easy, but it's vitally important to the American people, and I'm proud to once again be part of the FAA team. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. Recognize Brigadier General Matthew Brayman for his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Moran, Ranking Member Duckworth, Chairman Cruz, and Ranking Member Cantwell, and distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to come here before you today to speak about the midair collision that occurred between an Army Black Hawk helicopter with the call sign PAT-25 and American Airlines Flight 5342. First and foremost, on behalf of Army senior leaders and all of our soldiers, I want to pass my continued condolences to all those that are affected by this tragedy. I want to thank the professional work of our first responders and the federal, state, and local agencies that responded within minutes to the crash site and aided in the recovery. I want to thank Chairman Hamady and the NTSB for conducting a thorough investigation and facilitating a close and transparent relationship with the Army as we conduct our parallel investigations. The NTSB remains lead in the investigation, so I can't offer facts and recommendations at this time, but I can offer an Army perspective on the preliminary report and provide clarifying information on Army helicopter operations, and certainly can do that here in the Washington, D.C. area. For context, Pat 25's unit, the 12th Aviation Battalion, falls under the Army Aviation Brigade, or referred to as the TAB. And that unit has the mission to provide continuous, responsive aviation support to senior military and government leaders to enable continuity of government operations and defense support to civil authorities. The TAB is one of dozens of organizations, both civilian and military, that operates helicopters in the D.C. area. Our aircraft continue to meet all requirements to operate in the national airspace, in Class B airspace, and the helicopter routes in Washington, D.C., and they operate under positive control of flight services when within 30 nautical miles of DCA. Pat 25 was operating out of Davison Army Airfield at Fort Belvoir. The crew of 3 were fully qualified to fly in the local area. The pilot in command, CW2 Andrew Eaves, was an instructor pilot. The co-pilot, Captain Rebecca Lobach, was a qualified pilot in command as well, and the crew chief, Staff Sergeant Ryan O'Hara, was a standardization flight instructor. The night of 29 January, Pat 25 was conducting an annual proficiency and readiness test, or APART. And as part of that flight, was approved to operate at contingency locations associated with their directed mission. This has led to questions as to whether Pat 25 was transmitting automatic dependent surveillance broadcast out, or ADSB out. The specific status of both its operation and functionality is something that is under the investigation of the NTSB. The crew, however, was approved to operate with that capability off in accordance with Army policy. The aircraft transponder, however, was active with Mode 3 Alpha Charlie and Mode S when within the Class B airspace, and was emitting all the required information to allow air traffic services and traffic collision avoidance systems to detect and track the aircraft. Army policy does not permit transponder off operations in the national airspace. They do not permit transponder off operations. There is certainly no shortage of speculation on potential causes of the accident. I understand well the desire for answers. As the Director of Army Aviation and a senior Army aviator, there is nothing more important to me than the capability, proficiency, and safety of our air crews and those whom they transport and support in defense of this nation. And I'm also personally invested in the safety of our commercial aviation enterprise, as I live with an airline pilot, and her safety and the safety of her passengers is paramount to me as well, which is why it is essential that we see this investigation through to its fruition so we can have well-informed, fact-based conclusions to make desired change when needed. But where prudent, the Army is not waiting to take action. Immediately after the accident, the 12th Aviation Battalion paused all operations. They've only recently resumed flights and only outside the 7 nautical mile radius of DCA, with the exception of flights directly supporting the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and that remains true today. The Army continues to fully comply with all FAA restrictions on helicopter traffic over the Potomac River near DCA. The Army is actively participating, along with other military services and agencies, with an FAA-led working group to redesign the Route 4 helicopter corridor as recommended by the NTSB in its preliminary report. We've also issued interim guidance to elevate the approval authority to operate ADSB off. The Army is fully committed to a transparent and collaborative review of the events of 29 January and of all operations in the vicinity of DCA. We support any and all efforts to ensure a tragedy such as this never occurs again. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before this committee, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, General. Let me begin by asking witnesses questions, and then we'll alternate between Republicans and Democrats based upon time of arrival after the leadership of the committee has their opportunity to ask their questions. Chair Hamady, let me begin with you. First of all, I am interested in learning about the occurrences that have been described. I described in my opening statement about near misses and occurrences, TCAS advisories that occurred on numerous occasions over a long period of time. And what I hope you, and I will ask the administrator of the FAA these questions, but I would like to know, what did people know? When did they know it? And why didn't someone do something about it? In asking you about this topic, is the information that is collected by the FAA, that's where these statistics that we've each mentioned, that's where they come from. Is that true?
There were different sources of information, some which was FAA, some of which are voluntary safety reporting programs.
And do those voluntary safety reporting programs, it's voluntary reporting to the FAA?
Yes.
So, I want
Yes.
to give you a chance.
Yep.
Okay. Yes. So the information that has been described here about those events over a long period of time is housed and utilized by you, but housed at the FAA.
I believe through a contractor, but yes.
And do you know at this point whether that information was reviewed in a regular manner? Have you investigated why information that seems so important didn't result in changes in policy, rules, or regulations?
I don't know why. What I will say is this was a data request, came from a data request from the NTSB. We made that with the FAA and received information from the Aviation Safety Action Program, ASAP, from ATSAP, which is air traffic control, from mandatory occurrence reports, and we also received information from FAA surveillance data from radar. But this was a request from us, and that resulted in our evaluation of that data and our urgent safety recommendations. It is, I don't know if the FAA pulled that data themselves at any point, and I'd have to defer to the acting administrator on that.
That information was so valuable, so important, so critical, that that's the reason you asked for the immediate changes in safety regulations, true?
Yes, and there does seem to be an issue with identifying emerging trends and looking at, there's a lot of data going to FAA, and taking that data and looking at trends and not specific issues, I think is something not only the IG has raised, but others have raised, even the acting administrator has raised about having to do a better job with analyzing those trends. But it's key, because if we can get it after an accident occurs, what's key is getting it before and preventing it.
This is the wake-up call that suggests whether changes need to be made, true?
Correct.
Administrator, I'm interested in asking you the same series of questions. What did the FAA know prior to this accident? When did they know it? And why wasn't some action taken to encourage and in fact increase the safety, particularly at an airport like DCA and maybe others, and the proximity between helicopter and commercial air service traffic?
Yes, sir. So I'm very concerned about what we've learned in the subsequent investigation, both from the NTSB as well as our own reviews that we immediately took. Clearly, something was missed. I would say immediately after the event, we took the action, again, I referenced earlier, with Undersecretary Duffy's leadership, to restrict air traffic in that area, to ensure there was no helicopter traffic, as well as fixed wing.
My question is, what did not happen at the FAA that would have highlighted this problem earlier, at the time in which this information is acquired by the FAA, but apparently not looked at until the accident?
So the actual process by which, there's an ongoing review all the time of the data that is available. As the chair mentioned, there's millions of pieces of data that come in, and I would tell you that we have verified every single near midair collision was investigated, but there are certainly those instances where the information itself was not identified, and that's why we've put artificial intelligence and machine learning in place now to ensure that we're able to go through millions and millions, tens of millions of pieces of data to identify those trends and act quickly to mitigate those risks.
There's no question but what, had this information been utilized by the FAA or others, that steps could have been taken to make certain that flying, particularly again in the circumstance of helicopters and commercial aviation at a place like Reagan National Airport, there would have been an opportunity to do something had that information actually been known and acted on.
Yes,
True?
sir. That
True?
is correct.
Thank you. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following up on the chairman's questions, which is also my first question, Mr. Rushlow, can you tell me if this new methodology using the AI or whatever other methodology you're using to look at the aggregate data is being applied to other airports where there is close helicopter traffic in proximity to landing aircraft? Commissioner?
Yes, Senator, it is. We have 10 locations around the United States, including Alaska, Anchorage, that we're looking through right now, what we are referring to as hotspots, to look at similar trends, similar activities as it relates to fixed-wing and helicopter operations.
Is this methodology of reviewing aggregate data going to be applied nationwide, not just in this particular area, but to look at the overall trends of near misses at other airports, not just between fixed wing and rotary wing?
Yes, ma'am. So there are 3 activities going on right now. First, the hotspots I referred to. Second is kind of a nationwide use of this review and use of this new capability that we've just admitted. And then, of course, the ongoing analysis and how we're doing that with our industry partners as well as the military.
Thank you. According to NTSB, between, as we've said, between October 2021 and December 2024, there were more than 15,000 instances of commercial aircraft coming close to helicopters. 85 of those had a vertical separation of less than 200 feet. General Brayman, do you know how many of those 85 close calls involved Army helicopters?
Ranking Member Duckworth, we do not.
Can you tell me why that is?
That data in those databases is currently not shared, but certainly the Army is interested in becoming part of an opportunity to share data because that's relevant to our safety as well.
Mr. Rushlow, will the FAA commit to sharing that data with the Army?
Yes, ma'am, we will.
Thank you.
We've also asked for that information, and we're going to share it as part of our investigation with all the parties.
And I think this needs to be ongoing into the future so that especially the military aircraft that are flying within rotary wing close vicinity, these folks should be getting this data, and we can do that moving forward. Administrator, well, FAA, or I've already asked that. General Brayman, can you explain the Army's rationale for its policy that gives commanders discretion to determine how many crew chiefs are needed for a particular mission? I think it's important. I don't think that the civilian population understands the extent to which the Army does risk assessment and risk mitigation and risk analysis and that process. I think would be important. And how are you going to be implementing that process moving forward?
Thank you, Ranking Member Duckworth. I realize that I have broad authority as the Army aviation regulation proponent to direct how every aircraft and every operator conducts their mission. But the reality is, and I'm not afraid to take that authority and use it when appropriate, the reality is the best individuals we have to assess the risk of every single flight are our unit commanders because we hold them responsible. They have the authority, the responsibility, and we hold them responsible to take any mission that they authorize, look at the factors involved, understand the people assigned to their organization, and adapt that crew to meet those requirements. And certainly that is something that will be looked at in this investigation. Do we do that? And we will hold commanders accountable if they fail to uphold that responsibility.
Can you speak to if a risk assessment for a particular mission comes in at medium or high risk, how the approval authority of that changes? Because you mentioned the approval authority for the DCA area has been raised higher for ADSB out, correct?
Yeah, yes, Senator. So all missions go through an initial approval process. So a commander has to authorize a reason for an aircraft to fly. At the completion of that authorization, The crew then assesses all the risks associated, known and expected risks associated with the mission they've been tasked to do. That discussion involves a third party, a senior officer or senior aviator within the organization that then assesses that risk and directs the crew to make any changes to mitigate anything that either that briefing officer understands based on their experience. And then when those things are implemented, it goes back to a commander who must authorize every single flight. So in the occurrence of things like ADSB out operations, that authority resides with a medium risk authority. So a battalion commander must approve that mission in particular. And in this case, the policy allowed that to be delegated down to a company commander. And they must approve that it meets the standards of the policy completely. We have now elevated that risk to high risk. That requires an 06 commander to approve any mission that has ADSB off.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask your indulgence for an extra 30 seconds because my next question I think applies to everybody here, and I think people will be interested.
Please proceed.
Thank you. This is for the FAA. I am hearing that there is a backlog of air traffic controllers waiting to get their FAA medicals approved so that they can return to duty. And we have an air traffic controller shortage right now. I think in the Chicagoland area, there's about a dozen air traffic controllers who are waiting for, they got new medication, whatever it is, but they're waiting as long as 12 to 18 months to get an appointment or to get a ruling from the FAA medical office so that they can actually get back on the job. And they're just sitting there not able to do their job. And I think this is a problem at all of the major airports around the country. I'm sure every one of us has air traffic controllers waiting to be put back onto duty, and they can't because of the backlog with the FAA medical system. Can you speak to that? And will you commit, if I give you a list of my air traffic controllers who've been waiting, will you take a look at those folks and make sure that their medical issues are addressed so we can get them back on the job?
Yes, Senator, I commit to that.
Chairman Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On March 1st, multiple commercial aircraft landing at DCA reported receiving a traffic alert collision avoidance system, a TCAS resolution advisories, as they were preparing to land, advising pilots of an impending threat from above and in some cases directing the crews to take evasive action by descending. I think we were all alarmed that just a few weeks after the tragedy, commercial pilots were being told they were at imminent risk of a deadly midair collision. It's now come to my attention that these warnings were caused by the Secret Service and the U.S. Navy improperly testing counter-drone technology at DCA. Apparently, the Navy was using the same spectrum band as TCAS, causing the interference and faulty resolution advisories, even though the FAA had previously warned the Navy and the Secret Service against using that specific spectrum band due to interference risks. Acting Administrator Rocheleau, is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Let me just say this deeply disturbing that just a month after 67 people died while on approach to DCA, that the Secret Service and Pentagon would inadvertently cause multiple flights to receive urgent cockpit alerts recommending evasive action. It is inappropriate for such testing to occur at DCA given the facts of what occurred. And I expect this committee to investigate why precisely that happened. General Brayman, I want to turn to your testimony. On March 11th, Chairman Moran and I sent you a letter asking a series of very specific questions. This week, the Army responded with a one-page information paper. However, there were specific questions in the letter that were not answered. I want to turn to them now. We asked you specifically, how frequently does the Army turn off ADSB out transmission?
Chairman Cruz, as I stated in the discussion about how we approve the missions, a mission would have to fall into the category as defined in the federal regulation and Army policy. It must be It must have national security implications and be sensitive in nature to be able to do that mission.
General, you're not answering my question. My question is, how frequently is ADSB out turned off? I wasn't asking what the standard is. I was asking the frequency.
I can take the number for record, Senator, but I can tell you the types of missions and the majority of the missions they fly are missions associated with that national security mission.
Is it accurate that ADSB out is turned off for 100% of missions flown by the Army Air Brigade at Fort Belvoir?
Senator, I think you're referring to the June 8th letter from the Joint Staff to Representative Norton. In the context of missions, meaning the things, the operations that the 12th Aviation supports in their mission requirements, I would say that's an accurate statement. I would not say that's an accurate statement of 100% of the flights being flown by that organization.
Okay, so I want to understand what you mean by missions. Does missions capture training flights?
Only training flights that would have been operating in a location that's sensitive as part of their continuity of government operations.
Well, that would be all of them around DCA, is that correct?
Only specific sites that are part of that continuity of government operation.
In your one-pager, you said 75% of the flights are mission rehearsal readiness flights. Are those operated with ADSB out?
They are, Senator, yes.
So right now, today, the Army is flying helicopters in and around DCA Airport with ADSB out turned off. Is that correct?
When conducting their NORTHCOM directed mission, that is correct.
I have to say I find that shocking and deeply unacceptable. And I want to encourage the Army right now to revisit that policy and to revisit that policy today. And I can tell you, if the Army chooses not to, I have a high level of confidence that Congress will pass legislation mandating that you revisit the policy. If today another accident occurs over DCA with another helicopter that had ADSB out turned off, the Army will have very direct responsibility for that. And I am at a loss to come up with any justification for risking the lives of the traveling public with that decision. You can't change the decisions made yesterday, but you can change decisions made forward. Now, it's my understanding the Army has a memo, August 9th, 2024, entitled ADSB Out Off Operations in the National Airspace. My staff requested that memo from you, and my understanding is your team declined to provide it. That is also unacceptable. I want to ask you at this hearing, will you commit to providing that memo to this committee?
Senator, I'll commit to reviewing the information and getting what we can to you. Absolutely.
That answer needs to be a yes, that you will provide that memo to this committee.
Senator, we'll review that and we'll look at the ability to give it to the committee. Absolutely.
If it is not provided to this committee within 24 hours, I am confident that you will have a senior commanding officer give you a direct order to provide that that memo to this committee. And I just want to underscore, there's no reason the Army has to wait for the conclusion of the NTSB report to revisit your policy on ADSB out. You can do so right now. And I got to tell you, I spent this morning looking in the eyes of family members who lost family members. I don't know how I would do it tomorrow to another room of family members who lost loved ones because yet another helicopter was flying with ADSB out. And so I cannot urge you more strongly, change that policy right now.
Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too have asked for the same memo, so I want to follow on in the same line as Senator Cruz. I also want to associate myself with the information you're requesting on spectrum interference. This is one of the issues that I think, one of the reasons why I think spectrum and spectrum fights are so important is because I think the agencies with adjacency and issues, we can't leave this up to the flying public and But I want to go back because, Brigadier General, you mentioned in your testimony, we now have the additive dialogue that we just heard, but you said it's not allowed. You're saying it's not allowed. ADBS out was not allowed. That's what you said earlier. Is that in your testimony? In addition to the Holmes letter, you basically stated that using ADBS out, it's not like it was it was not allowed.
Army policy is ADSB out is not to be used for routine use.
Okay, so, acting administrator, did you know this? Did the FAA know this? Did the FAA know and understand and absorb this? Did you know that you were allowing a flight to go within 75 feet of each other and there was no signaling message that we have already identified as a safety measure is something that we have had as a requirement?
So I understand the FAA was aware of this. We have an existing memorandum of agreement with the Department of Defense.
Did you know it was 100%, as the Eleanor Holmes Norton, and as the Brigadier General is pretty clear this morning, we don't allow it, even to the point of not answering Senator Cruz when they're going to change it, because I'm pretty sure their attitude is going to be, we don't allow it. He's going to say he would rather have a route somewhere where he can fly without it. That's what he's going to say. And so, you know, that's a separate issue over here. Our job, though, is the FAA oversight, and you can't give exemptions to things that you don't understand. And so he, in their application, kind of made it sound like, well, it's not going to be that routine, but he's very clear. They're never turning it on if they don't have to. They're never turning it on. So what I don't understand is why the FAA didn't understand that. Why you would allow this design. This is the wrong design. Whoever said you could fly in this airspace this close together without a safety feature that was already being required by the FAA and then giving them an exemption makes no sense. So why did you allow it to happen?
So I can't speak to why the previous administration may have allowed for that memorandum of agreement, which is why we, effective today, will require in any DCA Class B airspace, ADSB out to be turned on, except in very limited circumstances.
What are those other limited circumstances?
So that
other
would-
agencies? Is there any other agency that's doing this?
So that we have 46 different helicopter operators within the National Capital Region. But again, DCA Class B airspace will now require ADSB on to be out.
What other agencies are operating this way?
So we have certainly a number of military units. We have local law enforcement. We certainly have the Department of Justice and FBI. We have a number of different agencies that fly the Park Police, and those are the entities that we're working with closely now to make sure, first and foremost, they understand the new restrictions that we have in the airspace.
Do they have exemptions?
Some of them do.
Are you concerned about this?
Absolutely, which is why we immediately put in place the requirement to have ADSB out on.
And so you think they're operating that way?
Yes, ma'am.
You think that Homeland Security is operating that way?
They are operating, effective today, they will be operating with ADSB.
Effective today?
Yes, ma'am.
So for the last month, you've known, as I am going to submit for the record, a letter from the Department of Homeland Security that basically says, under the federal aviation waiver, all U.S. Custom and Border Protection, air and marine operations in the capital region basically have this exemption as well.
So
And
they haven't had,
So I want to understand, if people were
Sure.
still flying in this airspace, we all fly in and out of this airspace.
right.
Do we now have to worry about other operators in this airspace that may be doing the same thing as happened with the military?
So
And
I
now
should-
you're telling me you're going to take action today.
I should clarify, immediately after the accident, we put the restrictions in place so that no mixed traffic could occur. No helicopters and fixed wing in the same airspace. Today, we're requiring the ADSB out to be on. So previous to this day, the fixed wing as well as helicopters were not allowed in the airspace. So we cleared
So now
the
today-
complexity of that airspace.
Now today, you're going to say to Homeland Security, you have to have ADBS, basically, the automatic surveillance broadcast system has to be on. You're going to make that today.
That's correct.
Well, I
For
would,
any of the Class B airspace that you can see in the graphic, in that red airspace, that's required.
Acting Administrator, you're not building faith in this system of oversight of the FAA if you're telling me that we now have a bunch of other operators in this airspace that you now said after the accident were prohibited, but now you're going to turn it back on, and if they meet this requirement. And we have letters from them thinking that they're exempted. I want to see this rule. This would have been a great debate with Mr. Bradbury before the committee, because the American people, these poor families have lost loved ones. This is not their day job. It is your day job. It is the day job of the FAA not to allow these exemptions to become prolific and everybody use them, and then us have to sit here and figure out how to do our oversight job of you to make sure that these details are exposed, when we can't even get a memo from some of these agencies. So, Mr. Chairman, I know my time has expired, but I will come for a second round with the witnesses, because I think it's clear. The NTSB has been very clear on the requirements for ADSB in, and in this case, if they would have listened to them, it's $40,000 to equip, $20,000 to equip one plane. You could probably equip the whole fleet of aviation for $100 million. I guarantee you their lives, the family lives, are worth that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Before recognizing Senator Budd, does the FAA, Mr. Rushlow, does it have the authority to supersede the operations of the Army and these other agencies in the airspace around airports? We haven't gotten the Army to say they're going to do this with their own policy, but you say you're mandating it. Do we know that the Army and others have to follow your mandate?
Yes, sir, they do.
Okay. Senator Budd.
Thank you. Well, first and foremost, I want to offer my condolences and prayers to all the families that are here today. I'm saddened that so many North Carolinians were lost in this accident, including Captain Rebecca Lobach and the 4 members of 5342's Charlotte-based flight crew. Samuel Lilly, Jonathan Campos, Denasia Elder, and Ian Epstein. Senator Moran, I'm sorry for the loss of so many Kansans as well in this incident, and I want to thank you for organizing this hearing. Chair Hominy, thanks for your work so far. On page 9 of the preliminary report, it states that the MPFR, the multi-purpose flight recorder's reading for pressure altitude conflicted with other altitudes readings. Ultimately, this conflict led your team to invalidate the pressure altitude reading provided by the recorder. Can you provide any details on the differing altitude readings? And do you have any update on whether this conflicting data was limited to the MPFR or if that was provided to the flight crew and perhaps was a confusing factor?
We are still looking into that and doing some testing. What I will say is the pressure altitude was determined invalid on the Black Hawk because we would expect that to be somewhat similar to the CRJ, but it was much lower. So we determined that that was invalid and it couldn't be used to calculate the barometric altitude. We would need 2 sets of data, which is pressure altitude and barometric pressure setting. We had the pressure setting. We don't have the pressure pressure altitude data for that. So we can't, we were not able to determine from that what the barometric altitude was of the Black Hawk. However, we are looking at other data.
Okay, thank you. General Brahman, PAT 25 was operating out of Davison Army Airfield on a pilot annual standardization mission at the time of the collision. Given the concentration of senior military and civilian officials surrounding DCA, how vital are these missions to readiness for continuity of government operations?
Senator, they're extremely vital. To go back to Senator Cruz's question about how many flights are done, 75% of the missions flown by the 12th Aviation Battalion are in direct support of the continuity of government rehearsals, exercises, and making sure crews are familiar with how to get that mission accomplished. And they stand ready every single day in a 15-minute alert
you.
string to do that mission.
Thank you, General. Can the Army continue to fulfill its priority air missions, air transport missions, without access to Route 1 and Route 4?
The Army is certainly, the fact that we're in the working groups will allow us to help influence routing that will allow us to continue to do that mission. I'm confident we can do that.
Thank you. Chair Hamady, again, in your view, is the permanent closure of Route 4 the only solution that allows for continued operations of both rotary and fixed-wing aircraft around DCA?
And it's permanent closure when runways 15 and runway 33 are in use. That was our recommendation to the FAA.
Thank you.
Yep.
Administrator Rocheleau, the aviation investigation report from the NTSB shows that the separation between an aircraft on approach of runway 33 would have a mere 75 feet of separation from a helicopter operating on Route 4 and hugging the shoreline of the east bank of the Potomac. Was the FAA aware of this conflict prior to January 29th? And given the insufficient vertical separation that we're talking about, was the FAA relying solely on controllers in the DCA tower to deconflict the approach to runway 33?
So the FAA was aware of the design of that airspace in advance of December 29th. I would say that's one of the reasons why we immediately restricted that airspace after the incident to review the circumstances around the airspace itself. In addition to that, it's one of the reasons why we are looking at hotspots or mixed traffic areas around the nation, whether that's Boston, Dallas, LA, and Anchorage.
Thank you, Chairman.
Senator, can I?
Please.
There is a DC helicopter working group that we have been trying to figure out who is part of the working group and get minutes and get documents from that working group to see what information was shared and what was discussed over the years. We have not been able to attain that yet, and I hope we can from FAA and others.
Are you a part of that working group?
We are not part of that working group.
But you have access to it, and they are willing to provide what they find.
We have requested information. We have not even been able to identify who is part of the working group firmly and get documents as part of that working group. We've requested all of that information because we do want to evaluate what was discussed. We're also going to interview the FAA cartographers on how this route was mapped because that 75 feet is max. That is the maximum. It goes down from there as the glide slope comes down to, as commercial aircraft approach runway 33.
Thank you.
So let me see if I can help Senator Hamady, Chairman Hamady.
That's a very hard job, no.
You are very good at public relations with senators, that we recognize the challenges you face. So do either one of you belong to this working group? Does the Army or the FAA participate? And can you answer that so the NTSB can pursue information?
I mean, the FAA, it's the FAA's working group.
It's the FAA's working group. All right. Mr. Rocheleau, what's the problem
I'm happy to work with the chair. We've been working extremely closely together on this investigation, and I'm happy to work with the chair and understand why she hasn't received that information and make sure we follow up on that.
Can you think of any reason that NTSB shouldn't be a part of that information?
Off the top of my head, I can't. I don't know why they would be restricted in that, and I certainly will talk to my folks when we get back.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Chairman, should we ask is the Army part of this working group as well?
The Army is part of the working group. Yes, Senator.
There are apparently 17 entities that are part of the working group. We just haven't been able to verify who all the entities are.
Surely the FAA is in charge, and they can help you.
Surely, I would have been happy to understand that before today and work
General,
with
you
the
know any
chair.
reasons that the working group's efforts can't be known by NTSB?
Absolutely not.
Thank you. Let me follow up. Mr. Rocheleau indicated that the FAA does have the authority to require ATSB out. Do you agree with that assessment that the FAA can make this decision and if you don't follow the FAA policies, then you're precluded from the airspace?
Chairman, the Army operates 100% under FAA authority.
Very good. And let me turn to the, perhaps the next steps or new information, and to this I'll go to Chair Hamady. Since the report that we're discussing here today is 2 weeks old, what has transpired, if anything, in those 2 weeks? Have you discovered any new and relevant information that you can share with us?
Where would you like me to begin? One thing I can say on ADSB out, off, that's policy of the Army, but we are also we are still looking at installation programming and potential for equipment malfunction. And the reason I mention this is because the accident helicopter, for this accident helicopter, no ADSB data had been received from an FAA ground station for 730 days prior to the accident. And that was abnormal. So we began looking at the fleet for the battalion. The battalion had 25 helicopters. That includes this particular helicopter. 9 of them were Mike models, and all were transmitting ADSB out when they were turned on, because we have to verify that it's working. There were 16 Limas, including the accident helicopter, which we're still looking at, but 7 were transmitting when ADSB out was turned on. 8 were not, and stopped doing so sometime between May and November 2023. We don't know why. 5 of those started transmitting since the NTSB identified the issue and began working with the Army to try to isolate the reason. So I just want to let you know that you can have ADSB out on, but you also have to make sure that it's working.
You indicated working with the Army, but there's other participants in this arena.
Absolutely.
And then were you narrowing it to the Army as if something is necessarily wrong there? Or more broadly, there's a problem in receiving the information?
For the ADSB out on, we wanted to look at the helicopter fleet for the battalion to see if whether ADSB out on, when turned on, was actually transmitting data. Because we did think it was abnormal that for the helicopter involved in the accident, it wasn't transmitting data for so long.
Any explanation, General?
Chairman, this exactly is what the value of the investigation is. There are things that you would not normally look at that are being determined here, and that's certainly going to help us drive policy and any changes that we need to do as a result of the investigation. And certainly the NTSB has the expertise to do that.
So what we're hearing from Chair Hamady is that there may be, it may be transmitting, it may be on, but there's no receipt. There's, I don't know, technical problems in the process by which it's not providing the information it's supposed to provide, right?
Chairman, obviously the functionality of any Army equipment, it's certainly Army aviation equipment, is important to me. So if we're discovering that there's a challenge there, we will take direct action, absolutely.
This is not an inconsequential thing, right?
No, it's not. And I think for the public watching, because I think there are a lot of people watching, is ADSB out broadcasts latitude, longitude, and altitude and velocity once per second. It updates once per second versus 4 to 6 seconds for radar, which is significant when you have converging aircraft.
Mr. Rocheleau, you indicated as of today there's a change in policy at FAA. I would be interested in knowing if that change in policy is only related to DCA airspace, or you are making those requirements, putting those requirements in place for other airports.
Thank you, Senator. So the requirements that I announced today are effective for the DC Class B airspace immediately. That part of our ongoing work, as I related earlier with respect to hotspots and the mixed traffic that we've seen that could be problematic, are areas where we're looking at kind of adding that requirement in. It seems premature simply along the lines of the way airspace is structured in different locations that we need to focus before acting too quickly. So we want to make sure That is, we're looking at the different airspaces and how they're constructed, that we're taking kind of intentional, careful action.
And that intentional action is underway. You're doing
Yes,
that
sir.
at other airports
Absolutely.
today.
And wherever we find a risk, we will mitigate that risk immediately.
Chairman Hamady, I asked you a question, then I interrupted you, and you sound like your answer would be lengthy of the things that you've learned in the last 2 weeks. I'll come back to you after recognizing the two senators to my left.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on what Chairwoman Hamady is talking about, testing the ADSB out, whether it's actually transmitting data, because the data was not received. Will we be able to check that with all of the other rotary wing operators that are in this region as well? Or is that something the FAA should be mandating? Is that they could do that? I mean, you're not looking at the other operators because they're not part of this accident, correct? So then my question for Mr. Rushlow is, will you be directing, will the FAA be directing all of the other helicopter operators, whether it's Homeland Security, local law enforcement, who have this exemption to ADSB out, will you be directing that they actually test their equipment to make sure that it is actually transmitting the data that can be received?
Yes, Senator, I think that's part of our ongoing work in the collaboration between those operators and how we make sure they, first and foremost, understand the requirement, and second, that their equipment is functional.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to also follow up on my earlier questioning about the FAA's air traffic controller workforce. I had mentioned, you had committed to looking at the list of names I gave you, that I will be giving you for the air traffic controllers who are waiting for medical review. I would like for you to, I'd like for you to commit to reporting back to me in writing about how many controllers around the country are waiting for medical clearances so that they can return to work, and what the FAA is doing to make sure these medical reviews are happening in a timely manner.
I will commit to that.
Thank you. In the race to hire more air traffic controllers, and then the staffing was adequate on that evening, but we could have used more air traffic controllers, obviously. And in the race to hire more air traffic controllers, I want to make sure the FAA does not lower your longstanding high standards for air traffic controllers. There could be a temptation to sacrifice effectiveness for efficiency, but the FAA must stick to its stringent standards to protect safety. Can you assure this committee that as the administration works to hire more air traffic controllers, you will not in any way lower the high standards that is currently required for individuals to become certified air traffic controllers? And there's plenty of places, a lot of them are in actually Kansas, that have the expertise to help us train air traffic controllers, as long as we keep those high standards.
100%. Part of our ongoing activity to surge in air traffic controller hiring is to look for the best and the brightest, and that's exactly what we're going to continue to do.
Thank you. You're back, Mr. Chair.
To follow up on Senator Duckworth, you should look to Kansas, and we'd welcome you. I'm going to turn to Senator Schmidt in just 1 second. General, the senator from Illinois was asking about routine maintenance and determining whether equipment is working. You have a standard in place that what Chairwoman Hamady said. It doesn't make sense to me that you wouldn't know there were problems with the transmission or the equipment. Do you have a protocol in place and that equipment inspected on a continuing basis?
Certainly, Chairman, with general aviation operations, we have protocols for the status of aircraft. I will have to get back to you and take it for the record on what the protocol is to ensure that ADSB out transmissions outside of the aircraft are being received. It's something I'll have to look on. How do we do that?
And whether protocol is being followed?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Senator Schmidt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my friend from Illinois would agree. I certainly don't want to see us reduce standards. I guess, in following in that same spirit, with Mr. Rochlow, can you commit that no hiring decisions will be made based on race?
Yes, sir. Again, we're looking for the best and the brightest, and we're prioritizing those who are best qualified.
Because as you know, there's a lawsuit by about 1,000 folks who are claiming that they didn't get a job because of their race, the FAA.
We're all about making sure the best and the brightest are there, and we do that through a
Great to
testing
hear.
mechanism.
That's great to hear. I did want to ask, General, and again, I apologize if this has been asked before. They're running us in and out of here, different committee hearings, armed services. I did want to ask, this was a very strong crew in the Black Hawk. Is it typical, or I guess, is it a problem? Is it typical and is it a problem to have someone who is a lower rank as this is my understanding, that the evaluator was a lower rank than the pilot? Is that a typical situation? Is that problematic? Is that not a problem? Do you think it contributed in any way? I just wanted to get your assessment.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. It is extremely typical in Army aviation because the preponderance of our force are our warrant officers, and they are professional aviators. That's what they do for their entire career. And so they are our instructor pilots, our maintenance test pilots, our safety officers, and our commissioned officers fill roles of leadership within the organization. So it's a very routine to have a senior member being evaluated by a junior member.
Okay, so I'm sure you've gone through this analysis, and I just feel like in the spirit of making sure we're getting this right moving forward, that you don't think there's a systemic problem associated with maybe somebody with a lower rank saying something to somebody of a higher rank in those kind of situations. You've went through that analysis, I'm assuming.
Absolutely, and that is certainly the personalities of crew members and capabilities is something that is considered in that risk brief process for every single flight. Is it the right crew? Is the crew mixed properly? Commanders would know if there's issues with simple as they don't get along, and commanders would take that into account before approving any flight.
And I guess for the FAA, and again, maybe you've been asked this before, but clearly in the chairman's opening statement and a number of the committee members, just the report, the statistics of the number of near misses between helicopters and aircraft landing at DCA, that, those operations now have been halted. Can you just explain to the American people why that didn't happen before?
So, again, I'll say that the reports that were come in previously were certainly analyzed, but something was missed. And since that time, we've been using new tools available to us, artificial intelligence, machine learning, to be able to scan the tens of millions of data points, to be able to do that analysis in a more proactive and ideally at some point here predictive way to head off, to identify risk earlier and to mitigate that risk.
But this wasn't a new issue at DCA, right? This is an issue that had been a longstanding concern. Is that accurate?
It's accurate. There were a number of reports that came in, and I would say that we've, as I mentioned earlier, we investigate every single near mid-air collision, and even as we talk about spectrum issues, Chairman Cruz mentioned, we have teams that go out and assess the airspace itself, making sure that we're working with partners, whether it's on counter-UAS technology, to make sure that airspace is as clean as possible from interference.
And so moving forward, obviously as a response to the tragedy that happened, and I would be remiss not to express my condolences to the families who are here. I know everyone has, and it's devastating for each and every one of you, including some folks from back home. And so your advocacy does matter, and it will carry beyond today, right? This is important. So I ask in the spirit of that, moving forward then, is that how you see things, that the state of play as it currently is now will continue?
Yes, sir. We'll continue to use the latest tools we have to be able to assess that data and work with the industry, with the aviation ecosystem, if you will, to identify that risk early and to mitigate that risk immediately.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Schmidt. Mr. Rocheleau, at the moment, whether it's on or off is irrelevant because there's no flights. You're announcing something that doesn't, at the moment, matter because you have not lifted the ban on the flights. Is that true?
So it's helpful to, if I can just point to the graphic. In the graphic, I can explain that in the yellow sectioned area, the the graphic there, that is where there is no mixed traffic. No helicopters, no fixed wing, except for those very few circumstances where we have emergency national security type of traffic. In the red section, in that red airspace, is where ADSB out, so DCA Class B airspace is now required. You'll also notice where, based on the NTSB recommendations, where we've eliminated Route 4 down going north to south on the Potomac, as well as Route 6 that formerly, you can see on the left side of the graphic, was in effect between from the west to the east where Bowling Air Force Base is.
I'll have to think about that.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, just for the record, because I see we have several
Senator
colleagues.
Cantwell, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to clarify on your point, Acting Administrator, we still have a rule that says they have an exemption, all sensitive. So I know you're making a declaration today, but I don't think that supersedes the rule. Now, maybe President Trump's going to call all these agencies and tell them to stand down, but legally, whatever the FAA is doing today doesn't take precedent over that rule. So when I come back for a second round,
I believe the FAA has control over that airspace, and they can say.
they can definitely shut it down, but as it relates to the rule, his decision just to say that you now have this requirement that a rule gave them an exemption to.
I think he can issue an emergency directive. Is that correct?
So it's the agreement we have in place with the helicopter operations that fly without ADSB out is an actual memorandum of agreement. It is not a formal rule. So it's an agreement we have with the Department of Defense and the other helicopter operators in the DC area.
And we can get a copy of that, the MOU? Thank you.
Senator Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Russell, you earlier testified that you've looked at the places, the airports with higher volumes of mixed traffic. I think you mentioned Boston, Dallas, Anchorage. Is that assessment, have you gone through all the airports? I mean, does that mean that other airports in other large cities or where we have a fair amount of mixed traffic are okay?
So we have 10 locations, a total of 21 airports. So we are doing this hotspot review, this mixed traffic review across the nation, including in the Anchorage area. So we're reviewing all the airspace designs to see where we may have this indicator of risk with mixed traffic. So helicopter operations as well as fixed wing.
And so you mentioned Boston, Dallas, and Anchorage. That's not the full list, I assume.
That's correct, sir.
And so when will this be done?
So obviously, 21 locations, I'm receiving regular updates. I anticipate that being, let's see, I anticipate that activity being concluded in the next couple weeks. I will tell you that our teams they're being very intentional about how they go through that airspace because it's been built over time as it relates to helicopter routes and other approaches and departure routes. So we're being very intentional, very careful. We don't want to move quickly with inducing additional risk.
Right, I understand that, but obviously time is of the essence.
Yes, sir.
When you're in a situation like this, making sure that even a preliminary warning as part of that assessment would be pretty valuable.
And any indicator that there's an emerging risk, we would take immediate action.
Ms. Hamady, you have in the past talked about workforce and making sure that you are fully staffed. And I think this is a direct follow-up on that. Are we fully staffed? I mean, you're going to look at this entire incident, and it's going to take the typical year and a half or 2 years, which, again, drives a lot of my constituents crazy. Do you have a timeline for when you will finish the full incident report or whatever the legal description is, when that will happen?
We've committed to 1 year, barring any unforeseen circumstances, but 1 year.
And so you have enough staffing on that?
We have 40 experts at the NTSB that are currently leading this investigation. It is a high workload because it's not their only investigation that they're focused on, but they're very committed to this one. And then we have an entire agency that supports them.
Right, we saw we have a array of past reports, and it varies dramatically, but I appreciate the fact that you're trying to accelerate this. I think it frustrates a lot of people that it takes, so long. I mean, how long does it take to gather the facts?
So, it is a complex investigations, and our investigations are very broad. And there's a lot of information that can change over time, and we are very fact-based, following the evidence. So we do, that's our credibility, so we want to be exact when we issue something. I will say, I do have to congratulate our workforce, because when I came on as chair, we had well over 400, close to 500 reports that were 2, 3, 4 years old, and they're now below 2.
Right.
So that is significant, but the complexity of investigations, and then the fact that some things we don't have control over, like if we can't get access to evidence because a district attorney or law enforcement is prohibiting us in a certain situation with a highway crash, that can extend the timeline.
Sure. No, I've seen that. But I think in something like this, where time is of the essence, I
Yes.
appreciate you guys
Agreed.
making the effort, and glad to hear that you have the workforce. Mr. Rushlow, in your testimony, you highlighted some of the recent changes in hiring, and also especially in the training processes to make sure we have more qualified air traffic controllers, but full workforce. I know you're working with local colleges all over the country on that. Is that is that working? I mean, I think if we can accelerate that, we have Metro State in Denver is a place where we're turning out some of these members. Is that something you can ramp up?
I'm very interested, and the Secretary has been very clear with the public as well as with me that we need to surge this hiring and do it well. Again, back to the testing, the surge, bringing people in. As it relates to additional college initiatives, we have an enhanced college training initiative, ECTIs,
Right.
that we're using in, I believe, 4 universities right now. We're working with them with respect to advanced simulators and the like to make sure that we can get more, what we'll call throughput, but more controllers through those schools and get them out to the local facilities, centers, towers, TRACONs.
Great. I'm out of time. Yield back to the chair. Thank you all.
Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me start by saying that my heart goes out to the families and loved ones of the victims lost in the American Airlines Flight 5342 disaster at DCA, and not long after that, unfortunately, as well, the Bering Air crash in near Unalakleet and Nome, Alaska, flying over the Norton Sound area. And I'm thankful for the chairman for holding this hearing and appreciate the NTSB and FAA and DOD focusing on the after action so this doesn't happen again, either here in DC or in my state. And I do want to focus a little bit on my state, great state of Alaska, because as I think all three of you know, we have very high rates of airplane crashes, highest in the country, and airplane crash fatalities, which is why we launched with the NTSB's good work in 2020 and the FAA's good work in 2020, the FAA Alaska Safety Initiative called FOSI. And in last year's FAA reauthorization, I was able to include a number of provisions with the goal of reducing the rate of fatal aircraft accidents by 90%. That's a very ambitious goal. And require the FAA to improve maintenance of weather equipment. So, Mr. Administrator, I want to get into that topic a little bit. I was just home. It came up a lot, how there might be cancellations of weather operations and infrastructure and reporting, which makes zero sense to me. I hope our federal government is not doing that. But one of the things in the FAA bill, I was able to include requirements for systematic improvements to the maintenance of our weather systems and advancing new technologies, and this includes a mandate for the FAA to take necessary actions to restore full connectivity of weather systems that are unable to disseminate information due to a telecommunications failure. We have telecommunications challenges in a state the size of mine. So can you talk to that, Administrator Rescheley? And then I would like to get an update from your perspective on where we are on the FOSI initiative. As you know, the Secretary of Transportation and our press conference that we all did together, and again, I appreciate everybody participating in that, has made this a very top priority of his. And yet, as we saw in Alaska, we had a fatal crash that, hopefully we're going to learn from. Can I ask you on that, on the data link, telecoms, weather reporting, which is a big deal for my state?
Yes, sir, I appreciate that. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit more based on our previous conversation. Your leadership, as a result of that and your request, I did travel recently to Alaska to go and understand more. I met with the NTSB lead investigator along with my investigators as it related to the Bering Air tragedy.
By the way, thank you both for coming up to Alaska. I know it's not the easiest, closest state to get to from Washington, D.C., but it's important that you're showing my constituents that it matters.
Yes, sir, and I agree. It's very important. I understand, having been there a number of times, the unique nature of Alaska, certainly its topography, as well as the need for safe aviation operations. So related to, again, reauthorization and the commitment to work to have better communications throughout Alaska, one of the initiatives, one of the reasons I went to Anchorage was to understand more about how the maintenance issues, the connectivity issues, whether that's on the telco side or satellite. And one of the things we're doing right now, and I met with our own technical operations people in the area to test Starlink, so satellite, because of the unique nature of it and the difficulty with telco. We needed another solution.
Yeah.
And one of the ways we believe we can do that is using satellite-based technology. And so that's what we're experimenting with right now.
Well, by the way, I really appreciate, the press here kind of went crazy and, oh, Starlink, and, that's actually really helpful for us. And we appreciate the secretary called me and said, hey, we're going to connect some of these terminals through Starlink because that's the most effective way to do it. So I appreciate it. I appreciated that you guys were working it. Can you give me an update, or Madam Chair, an update on the FOSI initiative, and then any preliminary findings you're seeing from the NTSB preliminary report on the Bering Air crash?
Senator Sullivan, this needs to be your last question.
It is, Mr. Chairman.
We are still working on that investigation, of course. The preliminary report was issued and did find that the aircraft was over 1,000 pounds overweight, but we also are going to look at the center of gravity on that airplane and see how that factored in. And then we are really focused in on weather that day as well. As you noted, weather infrastructure is critical for Alaska, and we have a number of recommendations on weather observing stations and also the importance of pilot reports and having air traffic control when a pilot reports weather conditions to pass that information along to other pilots in the area, and that's something we're looking at as part of this investigation in particular.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Sullivan, thank you. I don't want to diminish the circumstances that Alaskans faced and the circumstance you as their senator represent. We're trying to get everybody's questions in before the vote closes, and I recognize Senator Klobuchar.
Okay, thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you, and to the families, just such a tragedy, and I know there are those watching at home as well, including the family, Wendy Jo Schaefer, a Minnesotan mom, 2 little kids, and husband. And we lost her. So, Chair, I want to thank you for your work. I know how complicated these investigations are. And could you just briefly talk about any open recommendations on communications that don't come out of this, that the NTSB, I know you have over 1,000 open safety recommendations, and while this investigation is ongoing, just open recommendations related to technology and anything that would improve communication?
Related to this investigation?
Not related.
Oh, not related.
I
Okay.
understand you.
We have a number of recommendations that remain open, including a number of recommendations issued to the FAA. On communications in particular, I mean, one thing I will mention that we haven't talked about that we are looking at as part of this investigation is our longstanding belief that ADSB in also needs to be mandated by the FAA. We don't know what relevance that has to this investigation yet. However, it is a longstanding position of the NTSB. It will provide key information to pilots. And in 2008, in our comments for a notice of proposed rulemaking to FAA, where they decided not to require it, we said equipage of aircraft with ADSB and capability will provide an immediate and substantial contribution to safety. Just a couple of years ago, and we just talked about Alaska, we investigated a midair collision in Ketchikan, and we reiterated, and this is the statement, that NTSB remains concerned that without a requirement to install and use ADSB-supported airborne traffic advisory systems, mid-air collisions will continue to occur. And that was in 2019.
Okay.
So we'll look at that as part of this investigation.
Okay, thank you. We all know full funding of the FAA couldn't be more important. Last year, we passed the bipartisan FAA bill to improve aviation, workforce training, and actually Senator Braun, then Senator Braun, now Governor, and I had the bill to require the FAA to conduct maximum hiring of air traffic controllers at the FAA Academy. And I guess I'd ask you this, Acting Director Rushlow, you discussed in your testimony the efforts that Secretary Duffy and the FAA have taken to bolster the air traffic workforce. I think 91% of the air traffic control facilities operate below recommended staffing levels. I think there's 3,000, some short. This is, I got from some of the people who do this work. Can you talk to the current state of staffing and how do you plan to maintain recruiting levels? We did have an increase, I believe, last year.
Yes, Senator, and thank you for the question. This is a very important issue for the Secretary and myself as we look at the safety of the national airspace system in general, but certainly as we're looking to bring the best and brightest controllers into the airspace system to make sure that we're providing that safety for Americans as they travel through the air. I would say that as a result of this surge, we had over 10,000 applications. Over 8,000 of those have now been referred to testing. We've streamlined the process, cut roughly 5 months off that process. So going forward, we intend to have no empty seat at any upcoming academy classes. I would also say that we expect our partnerships with other schools, universities, to be able to bring more people into the career field itself. It's an exciting career. And even incentivizing students to come to Oklahoma City and with an additional 30%. We've kind of put all our focus on this effort in addition to the many other things we've got going on, but controller hiring is of paramount importance.
Very good. As you know, we have a very active airports in Minnesota, a major hub. I would ask you to look at the Duluth Air Traffic Control Tower, just because it's the third oldest in the nation, and Secretary Duffy's aware of it. It's had flooding, and it's a major air base up there as well for the Guard.
Thank you, Senator.
Yes, and Representative Stauber and I have been working together on that. Anyway, last question is just the importance of fully funding the FAA. Quickly, for both of you or all three of you.
I can talk about fully funding the NTSB.
Yes, please do.
You've
'Cause
done
it's
that
our-
on
I
previous
mean, you're
occasions.
important, but we did get an increase in funding that I do want to thank you for, to 145 in the CR. It was an anomaly, but for fully staffing the NTSB, right now we're at 427. We went down in the last couple of months because people left. We will be able to go up to 450, but fully staffing the NTSB to accomplish our mission would require hiring between 485 and 500 personnel, which requires resources. So as you consider FY26, it would be helpful.
That's very helpful.
And I certainly echo those sentiments. Fully funding the FAA is critical, not just for the workforce, but for our facilities and equipment. The situation is quite concerning to me as I review over 30% of our facilities being unsustainable going forward. We have to invest in that infrastructure going forward.
Thank you. I know that's no solace to the families, but knowing that, that you were stepping back and looking at all of this right now, so other tragedies can be avoided, couldn't be more important. So thank you very much.
Gives me an opportunity to editorialize. We need to pass appropriation bills and not continue to utilize continuing resolutions. And that's directed at not necessarily my colleagues here, but my colleagues generally. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with your last statement. I just have two quick questions. General Brayman, I have never had a warrant officer be afraid to tell me when I was doing something wrong in the aircraft, and I prefer to have them as a pilot in command to myself. Speak a little bit to crew resource management and how it works in an air crew, especially, it was not just about, this is speaking to Senator Schmidt's question, not just about between the two pilots, but also the role of the crew chief, and do they have the ability to speak up as well?
Thank you, Ranking Member Duckworth. There's nothing more important in an air crew than crew resource management, and that is taught from day one. And everyone has an equal voice. And obviously, the pilot in command is the one that's designated with the authority to command that aircraft. But I have never been in an aircraft that was ever in an environment where all members weren't a valued member of the team, and we rely on all those members to accomplish the missions we're doing.
Thank you. I'm just going to wrap up by saying how important it is to fund and resource the NTSB. You guys do amazing work. You yourself, Chairwoman, oftentimes I'll call you when something happens, whether it was a door plug incident or something, and you were already on the ground or in the air on your way there, and you need the resources to do your work. And as we're seeing from this investigation, how critically important that is, not just to find out what happened, but to prevent future accidents. So I could not agree with you more that we should be funding you. Mr. Rushlow, I think we also need to look at the facilities at FAA, and we need to talk to that. And I'd love to get your commitment to come out and tour the facilities in the Chicagoland area and see the condition of this repair that they are in.
I commit to that. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to the chairman, who's been very generous.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth. I'm going to ask just a couple of tidbits, and I hope they're important questions more than tidbits, but I hope we'll be short so I can go vote. And I think that Senator Duckworth will close out the hearing in my absence. First of all, the fact that ADSB out, there's evidence that the transmissions were not received, and apparently the Army doesn't know that they weren't received. Why doesn't the FAA know they're not received?
I'm not aware of that. I know it's a part of the ongoing investigation. I don't believe that we receive any helicopter information from the Army.
But somebody has to be reporting that they were sent but not received. Who do they report that to?
Again, I think that's part of the investigation. My assumption would be the Army.
Okay.
Well, no. The Army could have it turned on, but I think what the chairwoman is saying is that the receiving station got no data, so the Army has got it turned on, and they don't know that it's not receiving. So this is, again, this communication issue between the different agencies.
Senator Duckworth was speaking
sorry.
on my behalf. She said,
so sorry.
she said it exactly right.
I said you were generous.
I think my concluding question, and then I recognize Senator Markey. What is the current state, this is to you, Mr. Rushlow, of operations at DCA? How are they different today than they were on January the 29th?
Yes, sir. Again, I appreciate it, the opportunity to explain. So immediately after January 29th, we restricted the airspace and in the yellow box, as I showed in the previous graphic, for mixed traffic. So no helicopters or fixed wing will be in that box, if you will,
The yellow.
the yellow box going forward. In the red section,
And
that's
that is
where
still true
class-
today.
Yes, sir. And that is permanent. We've made that permanent. We've also eliminated Route 4 and Route 6, the crossing that goes over to Bowling Air Force Base from DCA.
Any other changes? Well, I would ask about number of flights. It appears to me, and my understanding is there are fewer flights utilizing Reagan National Airport?
Yes, sir, thank you. In the aftermath, we reduced the rate, the arrival rate. A lot of that was to support the NTSB ongoing investigation and the emergency response work. Today, we are running at what we call a 30 rate, so 30 arrivals an hour. And we're doing that largely in partnership. I mean, we received great information from the NTSB regarding some feedback they were receiving during their preliminary investigation regarding the workload on the controllers themselves. Obviously, the tragic event has an effect. I mean, these people come to work every day. They care about what they do. And so we reduced the rate down to 26. Slowly, we move back to now we're at 30 rate.
And will that stay constant or change in the future?
So that, right now, that's constant, that's staying. We're continuing to
For
monitor
the
that.
foreseeable future, the 30,
Yes, sir.
is it 32? 30?
It can go to 32, but right now we're at 30, and we plan to maintain that until such time as we assess the safety and being able to go to a higher rate.
Senator Markey, are you okay if I continue just a moment? I often, almost without exception, when I'm chairing a hearing, ask the witnesses at the end, the conclusion of the hearing, is there anything that you want to correct that you didn't say as you wish to say it? Something you want to make sure we hear? And then I'll turn conducting this hearing over to Senator Duckworth. Ms. Hamady?
That's when all my staff cringe when I chime in. On this one, I would say I know there is a lot of focus on the FAA right now. I do think they are very focused on safety. We have an excellent relationship and have been in communication constantly since this accident. I would say one area we're really looking at also is how the Army evaluates when there's reporting of close calls. Do they get those reports, the Army I'm talking about? And how do they communicate, at the battalion level, how do they communicate and talk about safety? How do they evaluate safety? Are they getting reports? Are they monitoring their own helicopters that might exceed altitude levels? We have found so far that a lot of the conversation and safety discussion at the battalion level is really focused on OSHA slips, trips, and falls. There is a disconnect on some of the discussion around safety and safety assurance from the Army as a whole versus the battalion level. So we're really looking at that.
Please answer this question, but just in my absence.
Yes, sir, and I appreciate the opportunity. I just want to make it crystal clear that something was missed at the DCA crash. I take that seriously. I take that upon myself. I returned to the FAA just 2 months ago because I care about the National Airspace System and the safety and the workforce. I'm dedicated to continuing that work. And I will continue to review what I mentioned before with respect to the hotspots, working closely with NTSB to learn what happened here and to make sure it never happens again.
General, I'm going to ask you to suspend so Mr. Markey can ask his question, because he's going to miss a roll call vote if he doesn't get to. I recognize Mr. Markey.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. I want to take a moment to express my deepest condolences to the families who lost loved ones in the tragic crash in January. Your pain is unimaginable, and your presence here today is a powerful reminder of the lives that were so suddenly and unfairly taken. I want to specifically note the individuals from the Skating Club of Boston who passed away in this crash. Spencer Lane, Christine Lane, Gina Hahn, Jin Hahn, Jenya Shiskova, Vadim Namov. We had a similar plane crash in 1961 that devastated the Skating Club of Boston. The trauma for the city of Boston and for your families is great. So please know that we grieve with you, and we are committed to finding answers and accountability in honor of those who you have lost. Chair Hamidi, thank you and the entire NTSB team for your work to investigate this crash. I want to discuss the altitude of the Black Hawk helicopter. NTSB's preliminary report notes that a few minutes before the crash, the pilot indicated that the helicopter was flying at an altitude of 300 feet, while the instructor pilot said it was at 400 feet. The report also found that helicopters may have been above the altitude restriction in over half of near misses that triggered an advisory from the plane's traffic alert and collision avoidance system. In your experience, are altitude discrepancies like this common, and are you concerned that Black Hawk altimeters may have a systemic problem?
This barometric altimeter, we've done substantial examination on it. We don't think we're going to get much from this altimeter because there was such damage. We're going to have to look at other data, but I think it's too early to really say what the discrepancy was or whether it was a discrepancy. There was no information other than 1.1 nautical miles west of the Key Bridge when the pilot flying said, I'm at 300, and the pilot instructor said, I have you at 4. There was no further discussion of why. So there's a lot of work that still has to be done.
Administrator Rushlow, on a related issue, Elon Musk recently made alarmist claims about the FAA's air traffic control communication system. He said, the FAA assessment is single-digit months to catastrophic failure, putting air traffic safety at serious risk. The situation is extremely dire. Elon Musk is in charge of all of the investigations into every single federal agency. That's scary. And this is at the same time that he may be pushing for Starlink, his own company, to take over the contract to upgrade the communication system. And 1 month ago, the FAA announced it was deploying multiple Starlink terminals across the country. Give these systems critical importance to our aviation system. These developments raise serious questions about aviation safety. So I would like you to set the record straight on this issue. He said, basically, we have single months, digit months to catastrophic failure, putting air traffic safety at serious risk. Is that tweet accurate?
I would say that the circumstances around our air traffic system are in great need of renewal.
I didn't ask you that. I asked, the public needs to hear this. Are we within single-digit months to catastrophic failure, putting air traffic safety at serious risk?
I know we need new air traffic control facilities. I know we need that. I know
you're saying we are at risk. Is that what you're saying? Are you agreeing with him that we are?
I'm saying our air traffic system needs modernization as soon as possible.
You understand, we can't have people heading for airports all across the country right now with Elon Musk, the ear of the president, saying that we're within single-digit months of catastrophic failure. Can you assure people that that's not the case right now?
I can assure you the flying public, to fly is safe. We have the safest, most complex system in the world, and it is safe to fly. I would also say the air traffic system is in dire need of upgrade, and it's something the Secretary and I have been working on intensely.
Well, so you're saying that this is not right. We're not within months of a catastrophic failure, because I don't think anyone wants to put a family member on a plane right now with this kind of assessment. Have you made the assessment that we're within single-digit months of catastrophic failure? Have you made that assessment?
I have reviewed assessments in the last 2 months and understand that our equipment needs to be upgraded.
I didn't ask you that.
We're
Is it
having
sa-
fun.
Is the existing equipment safe? Is the
Yes.
existing equipment putting travelers' safety at serious risk? Is yes or no?
The existing system is safe.
Is safe, all right. We need to know that, okay? Are any SpaceX employees serving as special government employees at the FAA right now?
We had 3 special government employees from SpaceX. We are only in contact with 1 at this point. I would make it very clear, they did not do any air traffic. They didn't plug into any equipment. They came in to observe our operations and provided expertise along the lines of software and computer systems and how we.
Did any employee have any involvement in the FAA's decision to deploy Starlink terminals in February?
I'm sorry, if you could just repeat that question.
Did any of those DOGE employees have any involvement in the FAA's decision to deploy Starlink terminals in February?
There were no DOGE employees in that decision. Starlink is being tested at a number of our facilities, only tested and not plugged into any air traffic systems.
Are any of these employees involved in the decision-making process around the deployment of additional Starlink terminals?
No, sir.
Okay. So I recognize that Starlink terminals may be an effective communications tool in remote areas, and I'm sure Starlink engineers think highly of their potential. We just need to be extremely careful.
Yes, sir.
That in making these life and death decisions, that they're not based on any pre-existing professional biases or financial conflicts. That's your job. You got to make sure this is the way we operate, because we're going to have hearings on this as this year and next year unfold. So I thank you, and I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to return to General Bremen so he can conclude his remarks.
Thank you, Senator. Do want to clarify 2 quick points. One on the memo requested by the chairman and both chairmen. It can be made available, however, it is part of the investigation. That is the unit's memo that discusses how they utilize ADSB out off. It's their policy letter. It is in the purview of the investigation. That is why it's not currently releasable. But certainly when the NTSB and the other investigations have done their due diligence, that we can look to make that available to the committee.
Sure,
For the NTSB, if the policy existed prior to the collision, you can provide it. That can be provided.
Thank you.
And
What's your second point?
And the second one, talking about whether we're willing to change the policy, the Army's policy. The Army is always willing to review its policy. Am I prepared to make a decision on ADSB out right now? No, Senator, but I want to do that informed by the facts that we have in this investigation. And those will drive policy changes. And that is not the Army policy, that's DOD policy. And the Army certainly has a vested interest in getting it right. But at the end of the day, what I'm most concerned about is the rigid application of that policy, that it's being done correctly and not being abused. And that is part of this investigation as well.
Thank you. Senator Cantwell?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to just go back to this this process, how it's set up in the FAA and how we rectify these issues in the future. But Chairwoman Hamady, I think you're saying in your earlier testimony that even if the Black Hawk helicopter had hugged the shoreline as originally described, that even that route that's outlined is insufficient. Your investigation showed that even that is insufficient.
Intolerable risk to aviation safety.
Okay, intolerable risk to aviation safety. So, Acting Administrator, how did we get to a point where we have a route that's allowed and mapped, that the military is flying, that's interfacing with commercial aviation, that as by the very definition, the NTSB is saying it was, even if they flew the correct path, was an intolerable risk? I think you're saying that because the difference in separation was just too small.
There's virtually no margin of error.
No margin of error. How are you defining margin of error, just out of?
I mean, just looking at this, and I think you have the printout in front of you, hopefully, or staff has it. that we provided. This is in, for the public, this is in our preliminary report and for those behind me. But the chart, when we looked at the when we mapped the glide slope and we looked at the helicopter route, which has no lateral boundaries, it's 75 feet max if you're hugging the shoreline. The collision actually occurred to the right and slightly above the dash line right here. And commercial, and just so you know, pilots for landing on runway 33 don't have to be on this dash line. They can be above or below. But it occurred about to the right. They were not on the on this route. They were slightly over.
You're saying under this route, they could have been below or above this line, but you're now saying that 75 feet is not enough separation.
75 feet is the max. Because there's no lateral boundaries on this route, it goes down as you come over. And so helicopters are not always on that eastern shoreline, which is where the 75 feet is marked. And they weren't in this situation. They were actually to the right of this gray shaded area, which indicates the route that has no boundaries.
But I thought your analysis, even if they were on that route, it's still an intolerable risk because there's
Correct.
not enough separation.
75 feet is very small.
Right, so how did we get to this point, is my question. How did we get to this point? It's like, it's a series of errors here, a series of errors. And so I'm just trying to understand, Acting Administrator, what office is responsible for this? What office is responsible for the exemption to the rule, which just made it worse? But what office said this is a safe pathway in agreement when the NTSB is telling us today it never really was safe? It wasn't. It was an intolerable risk.
And certainly I understand today, and even after the preliminary report, that was the assessment. I can tell you that, and I'm sure we'll learn more over time as to how the airspace was redesigned. I know that as a result of previous incidents that we've talked about earlier today, there were changes over time with respect to that airspace, but it's one of the reasons why we immediately terminated those types of operations after the event. So Route 4, Route 6, no mixed traffic into the airspace. Those are the things that we put in place immediately. I think when you talk about how did we get there, I think we're going to learn more of that through the investigation. Again, I can confidently say, without knowing specifically what's in the investigation, that over time, those routes, that airspace was designed. It's one of the reasons why we've gone back to the hotspots now throughout the nation to understand the circumstances by which we move traffic safely and efficiently.
What office at the FAA has oversight of this issue as it relates to this area?
So the air traffic organization builds out the airspace, and there's an aviation safety office that reports directly to me that oversees the air traffic organization.
And did that office ever bring up any of this data or information or have input from anybody that said, we don't like this scenario, there's too many close calls, too much interface, too complex, too hard to deal with?
On this specific route, I'm not aware of that. I know that when we are presented with those, and we have been, and that's how airspace changes, when we're presented with those circumstances, situations, near-midair collisions, we investigate them and we put mitigations in place.
Well, I'm questioning whether anybody was investigating. I mean, that's the issue. You had an alarm going off once a month. You had the data. Maybe you're saying maybe people weren't looking at it. And while I get that AI is this very new and interesting technology, it's no substitute for the FAA having an oversight over this level of traffic. And so, as my colleague, the chair of this hearing mentioned, that like now we want to know, do we have other problems in other airspaces? I mean, we're very focused on DCA, but now we want to know, we have big military complexes, 10 bases, 10 military installations in the state of Washington. I'm sure Chicago has a lot. We want to know, do we have to worry about this somewhere else because the FAA isn't looking and doesn't have an organization that is overseeing this information?
I agree 100% with you. This is of utmost concern to me, not just in the DC area, which, again, we've put measures in place to reduce the risk and to make the airspace less complex. This is one of the reasons why we have a task force working on what we're calling hotspots, to ensure that we're looking at airspace design wherever we have mixed traffic in 10 locations. I believe it's a total of 21 airports specifically, to see where similar traffic like this needs mitigation.
So you say this office reports directly to you, and you say this, they oversee these areas and the interface.
So let me be clear about that. The office that oversees air traffic reports directly to me. The task force, the group of people that are looking at these hotspots specifically, are part of multiple parts of the agency: air traffic, aviation safety, airports. So we have a number of people part of that effort to make sure that we're looking at the airspace design, and if we find risk, we react.
Well, there was risk, for sure. There was risk. It was being sounded in an alarm, and it wasn't being addressed. So now we have to figure out why that wasn't being addressed. There's a lot of information here that says very high risk, very high risk. So why was that ignored, or was no one looking at it? So we need an answer. I think this committee did very good work, in my opinion, after the Columbia accident, and set up more safety offices to make sure that we never miss something like that again. And I feel like that's the issue we're asking you today, and so we need to understand what you think is in place and why. If it was in place, did we miss this because little pieces of the responsibility was delegated to various parts of the organization and nobody had a holistic approach? Or, data, lots of data, and it's being ignored. But this is a clear that this was an unacceptable design. It's just unacceptable. And I don't know how we got there. I do want to ask you, are you now supportive of ADSB in as a requirement? Making sure that carriers like this regional jet, again, I mentioned earlier, it's $20,000 or so per plane. Why can't we just say we're going to do this?
I did understand from the chair earlier that it's been an ongoing recommendation. I have not personally looked into that in the last 2 months as to what the expectations are on ADSBN. I know that equipage on aircraft throughout the system can be challenging, but I certainly will take that back and look into it to figure out what specifically ADSBN would be, what would be required to mandate that. Certainly, if Congress passes a law, we would, as we did
already,
with.
We already did, by the way, we already did. It was called the reauthorization bill. And as I said in my opening statement, we basically authorized spending for this through the equipage program. And, you can discuss how this actually gets deployed, but I'm pretty sure the consumer ends up paying for it regardless in some way. And so the point is, NTSB has been recommending this. Is that right, Chairwoman?
That's correct.
You've recommended this since 2008?
And I have to look, but I think we actually have recommendations on ADSB in that precedes that. Those were comments, and if I may I add our 2008 comments to the hearing record? Thank you.
Without objection.
So I think, Acting Administrator, I think we need to hear from the Department of Transportation and the FAA that they understand that these recommendations have been on the table, and you need to respond to them. We don't want to do that. We don't want to keep doing this, which is having one organization who has to investigate all the accidents, deal with all the families, deal with the grief and emotion, and then have an FAA that gets too cozy with industry and gives them exemptions. We don't want that. And so what we want is you to listen to the NTSB. And I know this is historic. I'm not blaming any administration. It's historic. It's historic. It's been there since the beginning of the big crashes that we've had, way before the MAX, where the FAA makes safety recommendations and then they're ignored for I don't know, sometimes a decade. And then people finally say, oh, okay. But we owe it to these families. We owe it to them now. It's not that hard to get this done. So I hope you will take this back to the Secretary, have an internal discussion, and basically agree it's time to get this done. Yes.
And if I may add, and we're going to look at this as part of our investigation to see how it could have factored in, but the CRJ had ADSB out. It did not have ADSB in. And so we are going to look at what that information could have provided to that flight crew and how it could have made a difference. We've seen that in other investigations, which is why we have these recommendations.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I do think that a nationwide look is important. I'm glad that FAA is looking at the hotspots. I understand that many of these routes, it's not just the military that's flying them. It is local law enforcement. It is federal law enforcement. It is hospitals are all flying them as well. But I do think beyond a very local, local look, a national look is really important. Thank you all for coming. Again, my condolences to the family members. I just want to say again, thank you. Thank you again to Chairwoman Hamidi. Thank you, Mr. Rushlow. I know you've only been acting for a couple of months. We're without an FAA administrator for 3 years prior to your immediate predecessor. And again, General Brayman, thank you for being here. Thank you to all the witnesses for their important testimony today. Senators will have until the close of business on Thursday, April 3rd, to submit questions for the record. The witnesses will have until the close of business on Thursday, April 17th, to respond to those questions. And this concludes today's hearing. The committee stands adjourned.